Good morning and welcome to the Daily Bible Podcast. My name is William Hemsworth. I thank you so much for joining me on today's episode. Well, here we are. We're in the middle of Matthew chapter 4, and we're starting to get into the public ministry of Jesus. So we've seen him go through the temptation by Satan in the wilderness. We saw prophecy fulfilled just before by him going into the land of Galilee. And today, we see the calling of the first disciples. So we're going to read Matthew chapter 4, verses 18 through 20, which say, "As he walked by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who was called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, 'Follow me, and I will make you fish for people.' Immediately they left their nets and followed him." So a couple things. The first two disciples that Jesus called were brothers. Now the first was Andrew. Andrew was actually a disciple of John the Baptist, which is very interesting. So he was already looking for the Messiah, so he kind of had an idea already. But here comes Jesus saying, "Follow me." And so what we know about Andrew is very little in Scripture. We know that he is Peter's brother. But what makes it interesting is he would be martyred for the faith later on. You see, in about AD 60, he would be crucified on an X-shaped cross. He'd be crucified on an X-shaped cross in Greece in about AD 60. And so we now call that the cross of St. Andrew. And here we also see Matthew calling Peter Peter before Jesus changes his name to Peter. So that I have to explain that just a little bit. So Matthew's assuming to his readers they already kind of know a little bit about this story. So Peter's given name, birth name, is Simon. Pretty common name in first century Galilee in Israel. But in Matthew chapter 16, verses 18 through 20, we see that Jesus gives Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven and says, "You will now be called Cephas," which means rock. Well, that's the Aramaic term that Jesus used. The New Testament was written in Greek, and that transliterated means Petros, which is Peter. So Jesus doesn't actually change Peter's name to Peter until Matthew chapter 16, but here we are in Matthew chapter 4 with Matthew referring to him as Peter. So he's kind of already assuming that his readers may know a little bit of that background. Okay, and then we say that they were fishermen. We have this idea that fishermen in first century Israel were these poor people. Well, in Galilee, being a fisherman was prosperous. That was 80% of the protein that was sold in the marketplace. In archaeological excavation, they found Peter's house. And it was a pretty large house. There's actually a church built on top of it. It was a fairly large house. It was to house a couple families, which tells us that Peter was not this poor fisherman that sometimes we imagine him to be. He was in a prosperous profession. He had a pretty large house. So we could assume that he was fairly well off. He may not have been like Bill Gates or anything, but he wasn't longing, he didn't know where his next meal was going to come from though. Okay, he took care of his family, he took care of his extended relatives as well. The house is a fairly large house for those times. So Jesus says, "Come, follow me, and I will make you fish for people." More popular translations, I used the New Revised Standard Version. Other versions, you may hear the term fishers of men. And this is to allude to their profession of being fishermen, so they can relate to it a little bit. They're going to go now fish for people to bring them to Christ, the gospel. They're going to go preach the gospel to the world. And then verse 20 we read, immediately they left their nets and followed him. So remember how I said before, we have this image of Peter and Andrew being these poor fishermen. And when Jesus says, follow me, they immediately left. They weren't, and we have it in mind that maybe they weren't losing anything, when in fact it is the exact opposite. They were turning away from a pretty well-off life to follow this unknown rabbi, to follow Christ into the unknown. It was incredible faith. And also what's significant is that rabbis in the first century, their disciples would come and ask them to follow them. Jesus does the reverse. He goes to his disciples and said, follow me. So question for you today. If you're a Christian, you're a disciple. Jesus says to you, follow me. Are we following him wholeheartedly? So something to think about there. I hope these insights have helped you a little bit, give you a little bit more understanding into these passages. Have a fantastic day. Please remember, if you enjoy this podcast, please share it. Please rate it. It helps people find it in iTunes if it's rated. God bless you guys. I thank you so much for joining me as we get into the public ministry of Jesus. Have a great day. Thank you again. God bless you.